everyone, and welcome to the Cash Flow Connections Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Lyons, and I'm very excited for the guest that we have here today. She is the founder of the Remote RV Investor and American-Made Home Solutions, and she has over 27 years of experience founding and running numerous businesses. She has vast knowledge of the real estate industry and has several real estate-focused businesses, which include single-family renovations, multifamily build-to-rent syndication, as well as a capital fund. So Bethany Finch, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I sure appreciate being here.
All right. Really excited to dive in with you here today. And you've been in the game for quite a while. You've had the opportunity to participate in and experience many different areas in the world of real estate. So given your background and your history and everything that you've kind of dealt with, I'd be curious to know how you found and how you kind of got into the world of build to rent investing.
That is such a good question because I think so many times we think we're going to go down this path and we end up going down a different one. And for us, we've been in multifamily almost the entire time. That's been our wheelhouse all day long, any day of the week. So build to rent, it's like we had very negative connotations about new development. We saw a lot of new developments fail. We saw a lot of people. And through the years, I learned a ton, mostly from other people not doing it very well. And that made me nervous enough to not just jump right in, right? I really wanted to partner with the right people. I really wanted to really understand and know. So I'm part of the Kingdom REI Capital Group. And because of that group, we as a group, every year we're praying, Lord, show us what it is you want us to actually do, right? We're here doing something, but what are we doing for the kingdom? And how are we doing it as a group? And what does that look like? And through those prayers and through our first year, then our second year, several of us had the same vision. And we're like, okay, Lord, you're clearly binding us together in this vision. And so that's where Andy McMullen, Derek Alexandrenko, Andrew Gee, all of us said, okay, we need to address workforce housing in a very big way. But how do we do it in a way that the numbers still work, right? Because it still has to make sense. And we launched in COVID. So we saw the housing crisis just explode because of what they did in COVID. Yeah. So that's where the concept of build to rent was. We need to do this now. We can't wait. We need to do it now. And so we were kind of ahead of the curve in that respect.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that story. And I love the mission behind it too. I definitely want to dive into that with you a little bit more here today. But maybe let's back up a little bit and help us understand what build to rent is exactly, because you kind of see that term bandied about in a few different ways across the world of real estate, right? Is it just horizontal multifamily? Is it townhouse style projects? Is it a cluster or a grouping of detached single family homes that are all operated as one kind of multifamily community? What is build to rent exactly, and how is it different from simply building something like a garden style multifamily?
Yeah, that is a great question. So build to rent is literally, the concept is exactly what it sounds like. You're building something with the sole purpose of renting it. Now you could be building one single family, or you could be building 100 single families, right? It could be townhomes. It could be any number of things. But if you want to get good financing, you want to get agency debt, you want to get those kinds of things, you need to think more along the lines of horizontal multifamily. So in those scenarios, what we're doing, and there is quite a few operators out there doing it slightly differently in different areas. So we're in strong rental markets. We are building large complexes of 100 to 300 single family homes. There may be a smidgen of some townhomes within there, but you don't really have people above you. And then you'll usually have backyards and things of that nature. So it's a community, gated community. You have all the amenities. You have pools, clubhouses, fitness centers, the whole works, walking trails, dog parks, everything that you would like if you lived in a multifamily project. But when you're doing it this way, the moment you build one house, you can get that CO, which is the certificate of occupancy, and immediately put someone in there. If I'm building 100 unit multifamily, I have to wait for that whole building to be done. Then I can finally put somebody in. So you can lease up a whole bunch faster and you can get viable housing back into the marketplace very, very quickly.
That's a huge advantage to developing build to rent. I hadn't really thought about that. So yeah, I'm really glad that you shared that. That definitely Seems like that would take some of the lease up risk out of it. We can start to get some units that are online, ready to rock and roll, rent those out right away as you're kind of building the community. So yeah, I really like that strategy. And you touched kind of briefly on this in your commentary there, but maybe give us a little more color on what your typical build to rent community looks like. Because I've had conversations with folks on the podcast before who have been, kind of bigger, more institutional build to rent sort of players where, they're really doing kind of like the class A plus build to rent where, you've got the best in class amenities, best in class finishes, you're really catering to six-figure household income families. It's not as much as of a workforce housing sort of product. So what do your build to rent communities look like, and how might they differ from that like really nice class A stuff if you're kind of targeting more of the workforce housing sort of demographic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, workforce housing is what the local median income is. So, it's based on the average income worker, that blue collar worker that's there, not that white collar high level exec. And so, what they can afford. So, keeping that in mind, that doesn't mean they should get lesser quality, but how do we do it at a price that they can still afford it, right? So, in different markets, and you're in Phoenix, if I remember right. So your market is very similar to other markets that would probably think about it this way. You filter through what you know. So we're in your market, granite countertops are very expensive. But in the other markets in the South, it's actually dirt cheap. And
Mm.
so you can put some high level finishes on things. You can do some industrial looks, create some very cool features at a much lower cost. We're using solid wood cabinets as opposed to MDF because, again, what we have access to. So it's finding a way to keep the price down cost wise, but it's also structural engineering it. So, for instance, our developer and our architect went to work to said, okay, we need to streamline this because we knew we were dealing with supply chain issues. So, how do we streamline this so we're not waiting on shipments from China that are never going to get here or tariffs on this? And how can we fix and finish that? So, in workforce housing, we're really looking at and watching the numbers and keeping things in tight so we don't over extend that number, knowing even if they get a raise, if the inflation is going up, they still can't afford it. So we have to keep other numbers in play there. So we may put a pool in, but like our first property, it's only a 100-unit property. There's no pool on that property, but it still has a dog park. It doesn't have a clubhouse. It'll still have walking trails. It'll still have a playground. It'll have certain amenities that we feel are important there. But all of those units are 3-bedroom, 2-bath. On our other projects, we have one that's 160 unit. That's going to be a mix of 2 bedrooms to 4 bedrooms, and not very many 4 bedrooms. Most of it will be 3 bedrooms. But with that mix, now you've got 2 bedrooms. You might just have a roommate situation. They're looking for something different. That property will have a clubhouse. It'll have a pool. It'll have fitness center. It'll have much more amenities. But we also can only get 160 units on that particular project because the city required us to do a PUD, which is a all one unit, all one tax parcel. So it can't be bought or sold or broke up separately. It's got to be together. Where our first one, we launched in COVID, so we wanted to mitigate as much risk as possible. So it's on separate parcels. So we have the ability to break things out if we need to. So we don't have capital calls to our investors and things of that nature. And then on the third one, when we're doing the same thing, okay, they came back and said, well, no, we don't like the idea of you being able to break it all apart. So can we put it in, say, bigger parcels? So we've got like 60 parcels on that one as opposed to all of them. And we structured them in ways that, for instance, 2 bedrooms kind of being grouped together as opposed to spread amongst a bunch of 3 bedrooms, because a lot of singles don't necessarily want to be with a bunch of kids by the playground. And those singles might be senior citizens and, veterans or things of that nature. So we really put some thought into how do we build a community where the people living in that community actually want to stay. They're not just there temporary, but they like where they live and they want to stay.
Yeah, I love the thoughtful design there, where you're trying to put the unit types closer to the type of amenities that particular renter might value more. If it's a 3-bedroom home where you got the family and the kids and whatnot, maybe those units are closer to the playground where the smaller units, 2 bedroom, 1 bedroom, etc., maybe they're closer to the clubhouse or the pool or something like that. So I like the thoughtful design there. That's really good. That's excellent. And you mentioned a couple times now markets in terms of where you're executing the strategy. And I'd love to hear your perspective on, what are you looking for in a market to execute this particular strategy? I thought it was really interesting. You had mentioned construction costs and
Mhm.
materials being something that's really important for being able to execute this workforce housing type strategy. Is there anything else that you're looking for in markets when you're choosing places where you want to execute more of this workforce housing type of build to rent sort of strategy?
Oh, absolutely. There's so many factors that fall into that. So it has to be a strong rental market on its own. So markets that are maybe just standard, not really growing, even not even some, we've seen markets not even making a 3% growth rate. Some of them have even gone backwards. Those aren't markets we're even considering. It's got to have a growth. We want to be in that pattern of growth. So we're looking at the states as a whole, looking at their urban growth acts. We're looking at where they're mapping the flow of traffic that they want people going in. And we're trying to be in that path of progress. So that by the time we're finishing a development, again, that's a way for us to keep our costs down, right? Now the growth is there. It's fully supported and sustained. The city was willing to work with us all along because they knew what we were bringing, the value we were bringing to them. So there's keeping the cost down works to our advantage in a lot of other ways as well, because now we've got cities coming to us lifting building moratoriums because they love what we're doing so much more. And looking at it going, well, wait, we still need some senior housing. Would you guys do that? Hey, we need some of this. Would you guys do that? And it opens up a whole bunch of other doors and opportunities there. So the markets have to not only have strong rental growth, like just standard, but it also has to have new employment growth,
Mm.
because otherwise you're just trading populations. You're trading people that want to step up out of that older product into your newer product, but you're just trading people. We want to see an influx of new people to those areas. So we want to be a part of, people are coming to this area. They need to look and find a place, and we want them to come to where we're at. So they've got to have new employment. They've got to have clear job growth and market stability. We don't want to see rents going backwards because of legislation that was passed. So we're very landlord friendly, state oriented. Although everybody thinks we should be doing this in Washington state, the numbers don't make any sense in any way, shape, or form for us to do it in Washington or California. But we know other operators doing it in California, but they have a completely different business model than us. And so because of that, again, we know what we know, right? We know workforce housing, right? We're not focused on the luxury. We're not focused. We know workforce housing. So we will only be focused on markets where it's workforce housing that's employment that's coming to those markets.
That's a really helpful perspective on the market selection process and where you're going to try to go and execute the strategy. And, once you kind of select those markets, I'm sure kind of the next step is like, okay, now we've got to go find some parcels of land, some locations where we can actually execute the strategy, purchase the land, start to build, kind of start going forward that way. So I'd love to understand the land acquisition process a little bit too, in terms of, how do you go out there and actually source land for your build to rent projects? Is it mostly broker relationships? Are you kind of going direct to seller and owner? Like, how are you actually kind of curating and selecting the pieces of land and actually getting them under contract and acquiring them?
Sure. So zero of it has come from broker relations. What we have found is very few broker relations are bringing off market things, right? They're bringing on market, and the numbers don't necessarily pencil because most of them don't even know how to underwrite. They just know, well, the land sold at this, so I should be able to sell it for that. They have no idea about impact fees or any of that. So most of our land, when we're looking at a market, it's either a market we already have some leg in. So maybe we already have, as owners, obviously we have portfolios all across the country. So we're already looking at markets we're already a part of. We might be looking in a market that we already have property managers in. And they're like, hey, what have you thought about this market? And we, start looking at it from that perspective. Sometimes it's a matter of really the Lord just showing us, hey, I want you looking in this market. And then the next thing you know, we find so and so's grandpa. One of them was, it was so and so's grandpa had just passed and he had this land and he didn't know what to do. And he happened to talk to one of our other GP guys. And next thing you know, it looks like possible viable land, you know? So some of it is, you know, just God working things out. Others of it is very direct, looking at that Urban Growth Act map and looking at, okay, if the state is saying they want traffic going here, let's start targeting these, and these, find out which of those cities want to work with us, which ones are going to give us a hard time, and then start looking at, you know, properties within there. So it's we don't actually have to have too much of a deep acquisitions team, because it really is easier than people think when it's, you're not looking for every apartment under the sun. You're looking for a piece of land, you know?
Right. Makes sense. And in terms of what that perfect piece of land looks like, where you kind of see it and you're like, okay, like that's the one, let's get after it. It's located how we like it. It's got the characteristics that we're looking for. I'm just curious, like, what are those characteristics? Are you looking more for, you know, for example, infill versus kind of suburban stuff that's kind of flung more out on the city outskirts? Are you looking for stuff that's already entitled? Are you looking for just like raw land? Like, what are those characteristics? Like, how do you know, like, okay, like this is the piece of the land that's really going to work for our project?
Yeah. So, such a good question. One of the things that, you know, we're always walking projects and walking properties and walking this and that. So because we're all in so many different markets, it's so easy for us to see and meet a lot of other owners and investors. And a lot of times they'll actually have land. Hey, would you mind, you know, taking a look at my land? So then next thing you know, we're looking at their land. So as you walk a lot of land, you're like, okay, we don't have a lot to deal with here, right? The developers have it from their lens, right? They're looking at it through their eyes. Then, you know, our underwriting team is looking at it through a whole different, well, the numbers here, this, their impact fees are this, and da 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 da, you know. And then I'm looking at it always from the community. Well, we're going to have to build these 2 roads out. We're going to have to, you know, there's not going to be, you know, for me, it's always the people side of it. And so each one of us is looking at it through those different lenses. So the moment one of them says, hey, I think I found a good piece of land, then they shoot it over feedback, and then it either makes it to the next, you know, check marked of whether or not we're even going to go any further on it, or it doesn't. And so oftentimes we think it's going to be great, and then it gets to the next part, and then someone else has shown massive number losses that no, this one won't work, right? So a lot of it has to do with how close it is to current infrastructure. How much are we going to have to bring in if we're bringing it in? Because, you know, we're not opposed to 100% raw land. That's not a game changer. But if it's 10 miles away from, you know, we're having to build treatment plants, and now we're having to look at potential well drilling and, you know, different things. So it just depends on numbers as far as that goes.
Makes a ton of sense, and I'm really excited to get your perspective on the operation side too, because you've got the unique perspective where you've dealt with the traditional garden style value add multifamily space, but you also know the build to rent space as well. So from an operations perspective, is operating a build to rent community, is that very much different than operating your typical garden style multifamily sort of building? I'd love your perspective. Like, are there major differences? Is it very similar? I'd love to just hear you elaborate.
Yeah, they are very, very similar. You have your typical, right? You have your community expenses like your utilities and things like that. If you have a clubhouse, you have those normal things. You might have internet, things of that. As far as expense wise, you're still going to need staffing, right? You're still going to need, if you have 100 units, you're still going to need your on-site manager and your on-site maintenance. If you have more than that. In the build to rent, though, the differences are now you're dealing with yards.
Hmm.
So on a normal multifamily, all the grounds are handled by us. But in someone's personal backyard, well, we might only be doing the front of the yard and the backyard is on them. So we might be now having to deal with, hey, here's a notice, mow your lawn, right?
Yeah,
Or
got it.
one of the things we've encountered that we never thought was going to be an issue, when you list most of your property management software syndicates with like rent.com, apartments.com, Zillow, all these other places. When you only have 2 categories: house, multifamily. There's nothing else in between. So there's no build to rent, right? So because of that, if you list as a house, well, the challenge there is you completely get kicked out of those people who think they have to look at an apartment because they can't afford a house. So it doesn't even look the same. So when they're doing their searches, you won't show up. And it's a community. So if you do a house, you can't list, you have all these amenities because they have to be on site. They have to be it, so then you have to change it the other way. Well, if we list as a multifamily, people automatically draw a conclusion in their mind and they think it's up and down. And so then you have to do your marketing has to look completely different. Your verbiage has to look completely different. And we've literally had to put because some of these are literally the edges of the town. Zillow doesn't recognize it and it wants to kick it over to the other town. And so then when people are searching for your MSA, it's not showing up unless they get off the delete boundary and then it pops up. But nobody would know that as a consumer, right? So those are just little nuances of things that we're looking at. How do we, and most property managers build it out. They either look at you like, okay, I'm a single family property manager operator. I've got 8 homes or I've got 10 homes or things like that. Or they run it like a multifamily, but then they have to tweak all this other stuff that they systemize normally. And so it's definitely a learning curve. We're actually working with property management to make them more vertically integrated so that they understand it better, so they can grow with us, as opposed to just having one and then having to find a new one and train them. And because it is such a new product.
Yeah, really interesting nuances there. And I'm just curious. It sounds like maybe you're still kind of working through some of that stuff, but have you kind of cracked the code at all in terms of how you market the property? Like, do you bucket it more with a multifamily? Do you bucket it more as a single family home? Have you kind of,
We do.
okay,
We don't bucket it as a single family. We 100% go towards the multifamily. It's easier. You have less tweaking to do. And then sometimes people didn't know this, but you really can call Zillow. It's possible. You really can get a hold of people at these, big tech platforms and things. And most people just don't even know how. So it's figure it out, right?
Right. Got it. Super duper helpful. And what about the financial results of the property too? Like if you were to compare just a typical garden style multifamily property with a build to rent community, do the revenues and expenses look pretty similar? Like if you're just look at a spreadsheet with an income statement for a build to rent community versus just a typical garden style multifamily community, would you really be able to tell the difference? Like, are there major differences in either the revenues, the expense categories? Like, how might they look different on paper?
So yes, 100% you'd be able to tell the difference because the numbers pencil much higher for the build to rent. And the reason that is, think of a 100-unit multifamily, the commercial insurance policy for that. Now, 100 single family homes that you can get a master policy on, and now you're getting a discount because you have a master policy and each one is individual. So if
Mhm.
something happens, it's not going against the whole policy to one. If there's one fire in one house, it doesn't affect all the others. The loss is less, right? So the insurance is considerably cheaper by far. The amount you're able to get is much more. So a 3-bedroom, 2-bath apartment versus a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, single family home with a yard, right? I'm able to get a lot more for that than I am a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in an apartment building with people up and above and below them.
That's really interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the insurance piece too. Like that's such a good learning right there, a good learning nugget for myself, for the audience. I love that. That's definitely a good benefit there of build to rent compared to your traditional multifamily.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and
the
you had
other part
mentioned
too is the maintenance. On build to rent, it's brand new, right? So we're basically dealing with warranty issues for the first, sometimes up to 5 years. So your maintenance expense is considerably lower.
gotcha. Good to know. That's really helpful. And you had mentioned that when you look at a build to rent community, like the numbers will probably look kind of a little bit better, for the reasons that you just mentioned. So I'm kind of curious. It kind of leads me to a next thought here of when you're underwriting a build to rent opportunity, what kind of metrics are you typically looking at to determine whether or not that build to rent opportunity pencils out or is viable? Are you looking at certain IRR hurdles? Are you looking at certain yield on cost hurdles? Like, what are the key metrics that you're analyzing to really figure out if a deal is going to work or not in the space?
Sure. So the first number that always, everybody thinks, oh, I can get this land for 100K. oh, my builder says I can build for 110 per square foot. I should be good. And that's pretty much all they know, right?
Right.
So the first thing that has to happen is the builder tells us in that area with his market numbers, this is what he believes his build cost per square foot is. And that would usually include impact fees because each market has different impact fees. So then, okay, so if that's your build on the vertical side of it, now let's look, and we're now talking to our developers, right? So now we're talking about our excavation, we're talking about our infrastructure and all of that. So all of those, we're getting their feedback first, so that then we look at, okay, we can't run any numbers until we know this. Now it does not be perfect, but it's got to be a ballpark. And most developers who've been doing it for any length of time, or builders, they know those numbers off the top of their heads. So it's fairly quick for them to give us those numbers. Then we can then reverse engineer that to determine, okay, if we bought the property at this price, could we still make a return for our investors? And if the answer is no, then well, the only thing we can negotiate then is down on our price. And so we have to keep kind of knocking it down until we get to a place. We do require minimum numbers, right? So we expect our investors to get roughly about a 2x return multiple. We expect them to be 14 to 16% IRR. If we can't hit those numbers, it's not really worth it for us or them, because there is risk, and we want to mitigate as much of that as we can. And we don't want to be like too skimpy and just living with constant stress. We want to make sure that everybody is happy, because in the construction world, as we know, elections affect, and politics affect, and public utilities are controlled by politics. And how did this do this? And it delays things. And it's like, okay, we can't control that, but we can control what we buy that at and what we run our numbers at. So we're always looking at it from that perspective.
Definitely. And what about your longer term outlook on the build to rent space? Like, this is something that it feels like it kind of came out of the woodwork just within the last decade. It's this newer asset class. It's kind of one of the hotter or sexier asset classes in the world of commercial real estate right now. But when you think about the longer term outlook of build to rent, do you think that this is a fad that just eventually goes away? Or are you pretty convinced that, hey, look, it's here to stay, it's a superior asset class? Like, what's your perspective on that?
100% it's here to stay. And the reason it's here to stay is because I will get the guys, I will win. I will get my modular plant. And once we get our modular plant, once we get our lumber mill, right, and we're able to rein in those numbers, now we can take it to markets like Washington and California, where it's a tougher market build, right, where the labor costs are much higher. But if we can control those other ones, now we can address those housing issues in a very real, tangible way on a much larger scale. So it will happen. It's here to stay, but we have to do some other things to make sure that it's here to stay, right? We have to continue to do it in places that it makes sense, that legislation doesn't, like what they're doing in California is going to kill some of
Yeah.
their new developments, right? So recognizing, okay, so if we stay in those places and really streamline that, we can not only redefine it to make it just optimal, right? Run and plug and play in every single market. And that's the goal for us long-term wise. We're not selling every single one. We'll sell key ones, right? Just to recoup some capital and things, but we will keep and hold on to them. Our entire goal at American Made Home Solutions is to create sustainable growth. If you're constantly picking up your capital and having to reinvest and reinvest and reinvest, that's not always sustainable, because there's not always another investment to put it into. So recognizing that that's not necessarily in line with our goal, we won't be selling them all. And there's only going to be key ones, because we want to impact those communities. And we can't do that if we keep getting rid of them to other people, right? So key ones we'll be keeping and only selling, picking and choosing which ones get sold.
Not to mention, when you're constantly churning and selling like that, it's terribly tax inefficient as well. And there are 1031 exchanges and things you can do to get around it, but that piece of it kind of just hurts the long-term sustainability element as well. And Bethany, as we start to wind it down here, I've got one last question I'd like to bounce off of you. And as you've kind of evolved over your career, like we talked about in the beginning, you've done a lot of different things in the world of real estate. Um, Spent many years doing more of the traditional multifamily, but as you kind of stepped into build to rent and you've gotten into the space, are there any major learnings that you've had along the way? Are there any instances where as you've gotten into the space, you either messed up or stubbed your toe somehow? Were there any kind of tough luck learning experiences you experienced along the way that you'd like to share with our audience here today?
Yeah. So we filter through what we know. So I used to joke with folks all the time because everybody jokes about Seattle and how much rain it gets and blah, 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 blah. And so I would always joke with people, no, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I don't need an umbrella and I never wear a hood, right? It's like rain is not a big deal to me because we don't really get rain and people don't understand that we get mist.
Mm.
So in these other markets where we're building, I have learned they will get 3 inches in one rainstorm. So that could be a 10-minute rainstorm, and now you have 3 inches of water sitting in a giant hole that you just dug that now you've got to wait for it to dry out so you can dig another one, or you can put a pipe down, or you can get your concrete forms in. And so I didn't know or understand. So when the guys are like, well, Bethany, we couldn't work, it rained. I'm like, really? Put a hat on, guys. Come on. What's the big deal? He sends me pictures. I'm like, oh, I get it now, right? So I didn't then. So they intentionally, when we were out walking one of our projects in Dallas, my buddy's like, hey, I brought you an umbrella. And I'm like, dude, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. We don't use umbrellas. We're just fine. And he goes, okay. And we happened to be out, and sure enough, it started raining. And it's like the heavens opened up. I'm like, what is wrong with you guys? You got like a fountain going on. This isn't rain, this is dumping. So we had to learn how to deal with it completely differently than we've ever had to before. Normally, I'm looking at water flows and I'm looking for drainage stitches and I'm looking for venting and different footfalls and things, So for me, it was very eye-opening and at the expense of how much time it costs us.
Right.
Because if you don't time those right, now you're delayed waiting for it to dry out, and you can't just go put a fan out on this big giant field and expect it to work. So yeah, it was a very big learning curve in that respect, for sure.
Makes sense. Makes total sense. Yeah, the weather patterns in different markets, they can certainly vary widely. So I certainly appreciate the perspective there. And Bethany, this has been an excellent conversation. It's been really fun to learn about the build to rent space a little bit more with you and really kind of compare and contrast build to rent with more of the traditional multifamily. I took a lot of learning from this conversation today. And if people want to follow you and what you've got going on, what's the best way to do that?
So the best way to do that, honestly, is probably my YouTube channel. You can just find me on American Made Home Solutions. They can always reach out to me on LinkedIn, just Bethany Finch under that. But I have a book that we wrote specifically because just like you had a lot of great questions about underwriting, passive investors need to know how to do due diligence. It's a different asset class.
Totally.
So they may not know a lot of things, and we want to help them understand that. So we actually have a book that we wrote. It's an ebook. They can completely download it, and it's completely free. So we're happy to share that with your listeners, that they can look at that and see at any point, how do I look at an investment in build to rent and find out if it's an investment for me, and should I do it or not do it? What should I look for? And this is what we dive into deep with it for your investors.
That's awesome. And education on the due diligence side, it's so important for passive investors. So I'm sure that's a very valuable tool. We'll make sure we include links to your LinkedIn and the other items that you mentioned in the show notes here. Bethany, again, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Tyler, for having me. I sure appreciate it as well.